Hi everyone, I'm Lina Eklund, and I'm kind of interested in this question of does drought cause migration? And I've been looking at it for quite some time since I started my PhD and also after I finished my PhD. And I'm specifically interested in the case of the Syrian drought that was a few years ago, actually almost 10 years ago now. It feels still very recent, and there are still things written about it and discussed about it. So this is like the point of departure for me. And I'm wondering how many of you here have read this narrative of drought causing migration, causing conflict in Syria. Yes? Yeah, quite a few, good. So I've followed this debate a bit, and I've read this article by Kelly that I'm citing here. That talks about a widespread crop failure and a mass migration of farming families to urban centers. And this supposedly was something that contributed to the conflict, because apparently migration causes conflict. Maybe you've heard about that. But there are some questions in this narrative that I have been trying to address. So I've written a conversation article with my colleague, Darcy, where we just examine these narratives that people are talking about and try to figure out if there's any evidence, if there's any real evidence that Kelly talks about. He mentioned evidence. But so far, we haven't really found any good evidence for strong linkages. The only thing that it is that there was a drought and there was migration, and it happened at the same time, or like it happened after the other. But that's the only thing we know so far. So, right, so we have two nexuses. We have drought causing migration, migration causing conflict. In this presentation, I will focus on the first nexus. And how do we investigate this? If we start with some definitions, this type of migration may be a bit different to what Yahya was talking about, because here we talk about basically a move, a change of residence within, to, or from a certain place, for various and often multiple reasons. And, well, we can also talk about drought, which is a relative change in water availability. Drought is easier to measure than migration. You can measure it by looking at rainfall, vegetation, productivity, water levels in, for example, in lakes, rivers, and river flows. But migration is a bit more difficult to measure. It requires a very special type of data that is also not, it's usually not very easy to use. So population flows measured by looking at censuses is problematic, because you have censuses every 5-10 years. That's difficult. Migration can happen in a shorter time frame. Also, looking at sample surveys is difficult, because you want a long range of, like a long time range, to actually see what is going on. And for this particular case that I'm looking at, we have a lack of reliable data, and it's a conflict area. So we don't really have any good statistics that are reliable and detailed enough to say something about where people migrated from and to and why. And we cannot really go there, right? So what do we do then? My idea here, and this is, I should say that this is not a finished product. This is in the middle of it all. So I'm here to raise some ideas and to see what you think about them. And my idea here is to look at human presence or absence and signs of human presence and absence. So what we know about humans is that they manipulate their environment. They use land for agriculture, and they use electricity, they emit lights. So these are two things that we can actually look at using satellite images. And I've used agriculture mainly as a way to look at what people are doing and if they are actually present. So in an area where people are present, if they are farmers, the land is usually sown and harvested. If they are absent, or if they have migrated, the land is not sown or harvested, or the land may be sown but not harvested, that would indicate that migration has happened, or something has happened between sowing and harvesting. So to figure that out, we can look at the phenology of crops. And phenology refers to the change in season, so the greenness in this case. We look at greenness throughout the season. Like in winter in Sweden, it's not very green, but then spring comes and snow melts and everything gets green, and then in summer it gets drier, so it gets a bit less green. Like that. So we can measure that using satellite images. And I have put together a graph here that shows the same points. It's a mix of points in an area in Syria. And 1 year is orange. That's 2005. And another one is 2008. That's the blue one. And we see a difference between these two in the evolution of greenness. So during the spring months, like March, April, May, you have an increase in greenness, and then a sharp decrease. And that is the harvest. So it's sown and it's harvested. And you can see that in this profile. But for 2008, you don't have a sharp increase. You have a much later increase, and it's much, much lower. So it's not as green at all. It's probably fallow. And this is for many different points. So it's an average of everything. So it doesn't show really clear, sharp declines. So we may have some areas that are actually cultivated and some that are not. But in general, like the majority of these points are in areas that are fallow. So that is the basis of my land use classification, where I look at changes in, not land use maybe, but land activity. So let's go to the case of Syria. In Syria, there was a drought between 2007 and 2009. It depends a bit on who you ask, like how long it was. People don't agree on that. And right after that, there was a big migration from rural to urban areas. And then after that, there was an uprising that you probably heard about that turned into a civil war, 2011. So this is the narrative. And some people like to link these events together and say that there is a clear connection between these three. And there may be, but I will try to provide some more information about that. So first of all, we look at drought. We look at rainfall. We can see by looking at this graph that there has been droughts before. And for this year, 2008, there was a really strong decline in rainfall. But 2006, 2007, and 2009 was not as low. So 2008 was definitely the worst year. That's something that people agree on, at least. If we look at land use in Syria, you have cropland in the yellow areas. So cropland in the northeast, in Al-Hasaka, in Aleppo, in Idlib, Hama, and then in the southwest. So that's where you have people who are farming. So that's the areas you can actually look at. And if we look at the drought, the agricultural drought, so where we had less rainfall in 2008, and we compare that with my map of changes in agricultural activity, where I look at 3 periods. I start with the normal period, or what I define as the normal period, which is 2000 till 2005. And then the drought period, 2006 till 2010, because sometime then there was a drought. And then the conflict period since 2011. We see that these dark red areas are the areas that were cultivated in the early period and then abandoned or inactive or fallow or whatever you want to call it. Then there's all these yellow areas where cropland has been maintained more or less throughout all 3 periods. And then we have cropland that has been cultivated and abandoned during one of the periods. So, we can put it into numbers actually. First of all, 80% of Syria consists of bare soil, unvegetated areas. So I put that aside because that's not what we're looking at. So if we look only at the areas with vegetation, we have maintained cropland in 24% of that area. Then we have actually 9% that can be classified as abandoned since the drought period. So there's something happened, and so it was cultivated before the drought, but not after. And then we have this inactivity that turned into recovery. So it was cultivated, then not cultivated during the drought period, and then cultivated again. So some of the information that this gives us, or maybe some further questions are, first of all, does this mean a mass exodus? Or does this really support the idea of a mass exodus from rural areas? And what type of areas became inactive? We want to know where they are, which we can see, and we want to know why, and that is something we can maybe figure out if we look at where they are and what the socioeconomic and other factors there are in these places. And the same question goes for what areas saw maintained cropland. Why were these areas not affected by the drought? Why did people not stop cultivating these areas? So I also wanted to show you a bit about light emissions, because I think it's really interesting, although it's a really only something that I've looked at briefly. So this is, it's used a lot as a sign of economic activity. And that's where you have humans again. So this is Syria and Iraq in 2005, 2010, and then 2013. And you can see that Syria is lighting up in 2010 and then fading in 2013. What that tells us can be discussed, and I think there are a few articles on it. But it's an interesting way to look at human activity. So I just want to be clear about the fact that these approaches are not free from problems. There are many challenges in using satellite images to study more socioeconomic things. But and some of them is that there are no direct correlations between migration and land use. I mean, land use change can come without migration, definitely. And light emission changes can also come without migration. So it's not a strong link, but it is an indicator that we can maybe use if we know the context that we're studying. We have some problems with data resolution and sensors, especially when it comes to nighttime lights. The data is not perfect, and that is a big challenge. But it's still something that is interesting to use together with other information to get multiple perspectives of it. I think with satellite images we can learn about what and where, but not really who and why. So that is where we get a first step towards the answer, but then we have to use other information and combine it with other measures, and also obviously with qualitative information. But I see it as providing some small pieces of the puzzle, and it's really exciting to be able to do that. So thank you for listening. I encourage questions and suggestions.
Thank you, Lina. Yes, please.
Hi, Lina. Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Ekaterina Zhukova. I'm from Gender Studies. I'm interested in migration, but from different perspectives. So the question that I will ask maybe will be quite taken for granted for you, but very interesting for me. I was interested in these satellite images. Is it publicly accessible data? where did you get this data, and how did you come up with this idea that actually you can use satellite images to evaluate human activity there in an area? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, first of all the data I use is free, and it's provided mainly by the US Geological Survey and NASA. So that is something really good. You can buy satellite images too, but usually then you buy the more detailed ones, the finer detailed ones. And I'm working on a larger scale, so it works for me. Then the idea, yeah, that's a good question. Well, it has, I mean, I've studied land use without thinking so much about migration. I've studied land use in the context of migration. Basically, I just started twisting it around a bit and to see like how, I mean, well, I was trying to study, for my PhD, I studied migration in Iraqi Kurdistan and migration as an effect of drought, or I tried to do it. It was really hard. And I realized that I can't do that, but I can look at land use and what happens with land use in conflict situations and these things. And then I tried to put it all together somehow. And especially when they talk about in this narrative that, okay, so there was a migration because of crop failure. So they link this, like the people who migrated were farmers. They were using the lands and then they were not because they migrated. And that's where I tried to see, like, here I can actually provide some information maybe that can help.
Thank you for the presentation. I think this is super interesting. My name is Per Becker. I work in risk management and societal safety together with Mo. I just have a couple of questions, and I mean, this is not the first time when we hear this connection that drought causes migration and things. And I worked in Senegal for the Red Cross some years ago, and there it's a truth. I mean, in the 60s there were prolonged droughts, and suddenly there were massive urbanizations, and the whole areas around Dakar was sort of formed and everything. And I just think that it's quite bold to address that. I think it's valuable, and if you can sort of give other angles on that truth in brackets, I think that's very valuable. But I think I see a problem with your methodology, and if you look at the fertility rates in the early 1990s and things, so I mean, the kids who were young, I mean youth and young adults in this period when others have claimed to have a strong urbanization, there were quite a substantial amount. There were between 5 and 6 children per fertile woman being born in this period. So I mean, isn't it probable or likely that there was people moving into the cities that didn't affect the area that was, cultivated, where there are just 3 boys per family and 2 could leave and still one and the mom and dad could still cultivate roughly the same land. I'm just thinking that it could be that there are some truths in that truth in brackets.
Yeah, definitely. I think so. I mean, I think so too. I think first of all, the narrative is a bit, I mean, the way I present it is a bit coarse. It's very simplified, and but that's the narrative that goes through the media. Like that's what people hear. Then, I mean, clearly you can have migration, like this circular migration or like individual migration from a family to go into cities. And that has been happening. I mean, that's nothing new in Syria. That has been happening for quite some time. And so this, I mean, what I try to address is this idea of total collapse of the agriculture causing migration. Yeah.
My name is Alexander Indik, and I also study migration, but a different aspect of it, labor migration. Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. personally for me it was interesting to see how you can deal with the problem of availability of data and how creative researchers can be in finding other sources, alternative sources of data. And I have in particular a comment or a question to the satellite images of the nightlight. It's very interesting to me, coming from Eastern European context, from Ukraine, that in the 1990s we experienced a lot of light shortages. Or for example, it was the strategy of the government to cut expenses by, for example, turning off the light after 9 p.m. So I think, for example, maybe how reliable this data can be in, for example, addressing the nexus between drought and migration, and could, for example, this sudden drop in the night light emission in Syria after 2010 connected to the repressions that took place throughout the state by the Assad regime. Yeah, and from the technical point of view, I have a question. You presented the pictures from 2005, I think, 2010 and 2013.
Yeah.
And is it like the average picture representative for that year, or how do you put it together in order to have a single picture representing the night light emissions during that year? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, good questions. The nightlights are, I mean, they provide one image per year. And I don't remember exactly what it represents, but I think it's an accumulation of the whole year, something like that is comparable between the years. Then how good is nightlights in addressing migration or changes in residence? I think on its own is, I mean, neither land use change or nightlights on its own is a good measure of migration. But together with other data, together with other information, and especially with a lot of contextual information, it can be useful. And it can say something that we cannot really get information about from other sources. So with triangulation, it can be useful. But also it should be used with care, and we shouldn't overestimate its meaning. Thank you.
Thank you, Lina, and thank you also for not, jumping into conclusions with such a data. And I know from Lina's earlier works that she really combines interview surveys and also the remote sensing with the satellite images with the research. And I think that's what's needed. But let's say if we look at social movements literature, just because some people shouted chanting for bread in the Syrian conflict, they immediately make this assumption that drought led to hunger, hunger led to conflicts. And it might be the case, but again, or not, but seriously, more people might use maybe these kind of methods or many multiple methods in order to make such conclusions, because it has effects on public discourse. So thank you, Lina.
Thank you.
There's no more questions.
Yeah.